Okay, can you hear? Oh, you can hear me. Okay. So first, I want to thank the LMU and the Rachel Carson Center for giving me this opportunity to think, write, and read this summer on this new project. This is worth its weight in gold to have a place to sit and think outside of my regular ecosystem or habitat. And then second, at this point, my study only looks at this question of how clean is clean from the history of the United States. Since I've been at the Rachel Carson Center, I've learned that there are lots of other, not lots of other countries, there are a few other countries that have taken what I'm going to be talking about and using it to clean up their own hazardous waste sites. So as I move on, I may want to add some transnational or international ideas to this project. But right now, because, you know, how clean is clean, it's a really small question. Which I'm joking, it's a very large question, and so I needed to really pin it down to a very small piece. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about my personal story, because I'm embedded in my story, and I know as a historian that's a no-no. But I think I would be remiss if I didn't include myself in the story, since I was part of this story as you know, I was an engineer and still am an engineer as part of my identity. And as somebody said yesterday, once an engineer, always an engineer. So I'm kind of stuck with that legacy, which is good. So, how clean is clean? I was first confronted with this question 2 years after completing my engineering degree. I did not know that years later I would be looking at this question from a historical standpoint. Even then, as a young engineer, I thought, that's a strange question. The question was a title to a short guidance document that outlined for an Ohio EPA inspector the questions to ask and the data to review to determine whether a hazardous waste site needed to be studied and remediated. And I'm going to use remediated in scare quotes, and I'm going to say, and also they thought that meant cleaned up, but I'm going to use that in scare quotes too, because it is scary what we say what I mean when I say those words. So we're going to return to the word remediate a little bit later. Actually, we're going to move to removal, which is even a scarier word. So since then, I have watched and at times participated in the growth of that 20-page document. Literally, it was a 20-page document. I remember staring at it going, okay. Into now what is now tens of thousands of documents that try to answer that one question of, can you get this site clean and how do you do it? So I watched basically from the standpoint of how clean is clean to the modified question of how clean is clean enough, or is the risk low enough that additional remedial actions do not need to be planned or funded? Which, that's quite a jump from saying we're going to clean it up to deciding whether something needs to be, whether the risk is low enough to see if we don't need to do anything. I need to talk about myself, which I kind of already mentioned, and I'm also going to talk about it from a historical standpoint. How did I get here? And then how did the change happen over time? So first I need to explore the personal. Please, I'm going to apologize for some of my stories and kind of the personal aspect of this talk, since I am a historian. So I'm going to start with some of the information you've already heard. So I graduated as a chemical engineer from Case Western Reserve University in Cleveland, Ohio. And I found my first job working for Ohio EPA. And in the United States, the way the situation works is there's the federal EPA, and then states all have their own organizations that both regulate federal law, environmental law, and separate state environmental law. So I worked for the state of Ohio, so I regulated both from the federal standpoint and the state standpoint. So among other activities, I inspected industrial facilities that generated, treated, disposed, and stored hazardous waste. I had a lot of adventures. And I got to learn a lot about industrial processing. I've seen everything from primary steel making, which most people don't get to see anymore because there's actually no primary steel making in the United States, to watching somebody assemble a railroad car from all the pieces parts to a railroad car, which was kind of an interesting experience as a young engineer. But one thing I always have to remind people is that I was an EPA inspector at the end of what I call the bad old days. And I know we're still in the bad old days in a lot of other countries, but in the United States, this was the end of our bad old days. And essentially, at this time, corporations and small businesses were still dumping things. They were burying drums where they weren't supposed to. They were dumping things into open ditches. A few times I actually watched people dump stuff out windows onto the ground outside the facility. And this is the late 80s, so we've kind of come a long way, I think. So I'm going to have a few more examples. One is I was actually lied to by a man who was illegally dumping drums at the Cleveland airport. He actually pled guilty to dumping the waste, but one of the things they pled out was he was not found guilty of lying to me, which was a criminal offense, which is they basically said, if you agree to say you legally dispose, we won't charge you with lying to an EPA inspector, which is actually a felony, which was kind of interesting. It had a lot of power. And in another, I want to give you a lighter note. On another inspection, we went to this small facility where people were dumping liquids back behind the facility. And so they called us, and we walked behind the facility, and we started looking around, and my friend and I are like, those are marijuana plants. So we went to the man that ran the plant and said, your employees are growing marijuana in your back property. So I always call that my professional highlight because the man did not know what a marijuana plant looked like. And in the United States, now you know what one looked like, but back in the 80s, not so much. So now I'm not working on a memoir, so even though I would love to. So I need to get back to the historical question. So as I worked on more and more hazardous waste sites, I began to see a trend. By now I had left the government and I began working for environmental consulting firms. And as a consultant, I first noticed that most of the abandoned waste sites that I worked on had this similar narrative, which I have since found out environmental historians had the same narrative. In the late 1940s and early 1950s, Company A began to dispose of its wastes into depressions in the property. And then over the next 20 to 30 years, Company A just continued to dump their waste in until they either shut down, moved, covered it up, or were purchased by a bigger company that had deeper pockets. And in my years as a consultant, the sites I worked on literally are the plethora of every bad chemical you can imagine. PCBs, oils, chlorinated hydrocarbons, heavy metals, PAHs, and pesticides. And I wondered, why did this happen? I'm an engineer. I didn't know about Bhopal. I mean, if I didn't read the news, I wouldn't have known that Bhopal happened. So as an engineer, I didn't understand the history behind how this happened. And of course, there are three, I consider three. One is World War II ended. And in the United States, the returning GIs came back. And that's the second one. This increased population, because of the returning GIs, as we call them, increased prosperity and increased stability in the United States. And then third, this increased prosperity brought increased consumerism. The rise of the middle class's standard of living and suburban migration are some of them. And then also greater accessibility to colleges allowed many families to earn higher incomes. And when you earn a higher income, then you buy stuff. At least in the United States you do. You buy appliances, cars, washing machines. So people now had more leisure time. But at the same time as all that's happening, these corporations are spewing these chemicals into the air, into the water, and onto the land. And this is all prior to any of the acts in the United States that kind of stopped some of this or permitted some of this. So I was basically experiencing the aftermath of this situation in real time. I was watching and learning about these sites. So 10 years after the passage of Superfund legislation, corporations and the US EPA and communities were beginning to identify and assess all these sites. I won't get into what Superfund is, since I only have 25 minutes, but I'll be happy to talk about it if anybody has any questions about it. And essentially, the idea was to remove and contain the contamination. Now, by then I knew that Superfund was not about remediation. I worked on a site actually that had so much pesticide contamination that it was in the percentage range. And I was right on the river in Jacksonville, Florida, and we spent our afternoon while we were sampling shooing the birds off this property because we didn't want them to eat anything on the property because of the effects DDT has on birds. And so it was really interesting to kind of become this activist in the midst of shilling for corporations. So it's 8 years after I first came across this question, is how clean is clean? And I realized the question was not so clear. And there were many reasons for this change that I experienced. One is, first of all, there were more sites than anybody imagined that were contaminated. And two, the government and corporations were realizing that with new detection levels, we were finding more contamination. We can go down 30, 40 feet in some cases and find contamination where we never saw it before because of technology. And we were finding it in the groundwater. Third, the detection levels for chemical analysis were getting lower and lower. We used to find things in parts per thousand. Now we found things in parts per million. Then we went to parts per billion. And then when you get into dioxins, it's into parts per trillion. And we would have never found those chemicals and known that they were there without these detection technologies. And I was watching all that happen over my career. So I was confronted with this dilemma. Do I really want to do this for the rest of my life? I hated my job, as you have heard. And I always wanted to enter academia, even though, because I never knew that was something I could do as a working class person from Pittsburgh. So one of the reasons I left is because of the lack of action of corporations. They really were not doing what they were supposed to do. With EPA, I started my job when Ronald Reagan was president. And his decimation of the US EPA. So I decided to go back to graduate school, and I got as you heard, my master's in environmental studies and my PhD in history. Now, how did I get back to this question? And essentially, when I was studying for my first book, I came at that was part of my moment of clarity, that this is not just an environmental remediation problem. When I looked at the Santa Barbara oil spill, what was happening was it was at the time period where we had people looking at the results of the spill going, all the oil's gone, the birds are fine, the fish are fine, everything's going to be great because we can't see the oil anymore, and when we count the fish, there are a number of fish, everything's fine. And there's other scientists that were like, no. There's this thing called gas chromatography, mass spectrometry. Back then it was just gas chromatography. And they're finding oil in the sand, in the sediments, in the fish, in the birds. So it's still there. And what does that mean? We have one person saying it's clean and one person saying it's not clean. So that's kind of how I got to this. So that's my long path story to this question of how did the changes happen? How did we get to this place, this time, this knowledge, and this understanding of clean? So as I've talked to people, when I said the term "how clean is clean," everybody had a different idea of what potentially this talk could look at like. And first I was intimidated, and then I was like, no, this is great, because this really gets me to get the idea that this idea is very important, and it also, you can go at this problem in many, many ways. So what methodological frame am I going to be using? Because I think it's very important, because it's such a big question. What does clean mean? So I've decided to use something called hodology, which is kind of a new word to me, but it's the study that means the path, a path. And it's the concept of moving through time and space, which is what I did in my career. So, oops, they warned me that it was going to be touchy. So in geography, it's the study of paths. In philosophy, it's the study of interconnected ideas, and in neuroscience, it's the study of patterns of connections in the brain. I've decided I'm going to create an environmental history hodology. I want to say it's the study of connections between humans, places, and ideas, and in my case, chemical pollution. That's what I'm ultimately interested in, is our relationship with chemical pollution. And the big thing it does is it links space, knowledge, and cognition. I have a husband who's a neuroscientist, and it's all about cognition. So what does this mean? So I have some really kind of cool little tables or figures. So basically, you're looking at outcomes. Historians like to look at outcomes. The Civil War, the Renaissance, the end of apartheid in South Africa. These are moments that things have moved, things have changed, great ideas that people notice, that supra-threshold event. And that's how we move from one period to another. We may want to call it structuralism. That's one way to look at history. Then you have the idea of these overriding ideas, whether it's, I use the example of Chomsky's idea of progress and Foucault's idea of power. We're taking these ideas and we're looking at history from that standpoint. That's progress, that's power. And we're taking those ideas and putting it on things that happened during a particular time period. So that's another way we may want to use hodology. But what I want to do is I want to take a look at the sub-threshold paths. I want to take a look at these little things that happened, which to me were big things, and to the people that worked on them were big things, and show how we move through time this way, from this idea of how clean is clean to how is the risk so low. So that's one of the things I'm going to try to do with my project. So I want to use some stepping stones. I'm going to use the path narrative a little bit. So the three issues that I think that are important are the idea of risk assessment, the idea of environmental contamination, and environmental justice are three lenses or three stepping stones I'm going to use to move through this time period that I'm looking at. And I'm looking at a very small time period. I'm looking at it from 1980, when Superfund passes in the United States, to when the how clean is clean enough is part of the credo. So that's the mid-1990s. So I'm going to use each one of those, and I'm going to say, how did they change, and how did they change the actors? Specifically, in risk assessment, it's the idea of government accepting risk assessment as a means to say whether a site's hazardous or not. Then environmental contamination, how it changes during these years. And then finally, environmental justice. And the reason why environmental justice is so important is in the middle of these years, a paper by a document by the title Toxic Waste and Race is published by the UCC, which really makes people realize in the United States that most contaminated sites, uncontrolled contaminated sites, are located in poor or persons of color communities. It's not in Beverly Hills, except of course Beverly Hills has oil fields, but most people would never know that because they do a really good job of camouflaging them. But most of them are in poor communities. And the other thing I need to use is I also need to talk about government structures, because since I was in the government and I worked primarily at that level, the government, what the people in the government did is very important to me. So the government structures I'm going to look at are the laws, Resource Conservation and Recovery Act, the Comprehensive Environmental Response Compensation and Liability Act, the Superfund Amendments and Reauthorization Act, which are the laws that basically said this is how we're going to structure the cleanup of hazardous waste sites in the United States. Then we have the agencies. You have the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, and then you have all these miscellaneous state agencies. Okay, so how am I going to do this? So the first thing I decided to do was to look at a site I did not work on, a site I knew nothing about, and also a site that nobody has ever heard about. I've tried to find a site that was in Toxic Waste and Race and no one had ever heard of. So I chose Waste Disposal Inc. Has anyone ever heard of this site? I hope not. Okay, we have somebody who's from the area. Okay, I'm gonna have to ask him to leave. So it's in Santa Fe Springs, California. If you've ever been to California and you've driven on the 605, you've driven through Santa Fe Springs and you've probably been about less than a mile from this site. It's a closed waste landfill, and it was operated from 1928 to 1964. And of course, from 1928 to 1949, it just took stuff in and no one paid any attention. In 1949, someone paid a little bit more attention. I'm being kind of facetious. It was permitted by the health department to accept acetylene sludge, brewery liquids, and liquids from cesspools, which I also otherwise known as depressions in the property. These depressions in the property were filling. They needed to get rid of this stuff, so they sent it here. So this is this site. The other thing is it's in a primarily Latino community, lower to middle class. Now I would say probably the homes in Santa Fe Springs are probably worth a lot of money just because of California wages. But back then this was a fairly poor community. So the chronology. 1953, you get your first complaints. It smells, it's making me sick, it's making my eyes water. In 1964, the site closes. And what they do is the idea of closure back then and even today is you put 2 to 4.5 meters of fill on the disposal area and you walk away. So of course everyone forgets about the site as the narrative goes. And a private Catholic high school opens up next door. My favorite story is when it first opened, they used to have their baseball field used to be right next to the site. And the guys that could hit baseballs a long way, the balls would go into this contaminated area, and they'd always have to go run in and get them and come back. So this site was used. Kids played in it. It's right in the middle of the area. Homes are 50 feet away from it. So it's an area that was used. So of course, 1980 Superfund passes. And so between 1980 and 1983, the site is identified as one of 750 sites in California that needs to be remediated. And in 1985, it's listed as the 39th most toxic site in the state of California. Now, I would love, and I'm trying to figure out how they got that number, but that's actually I need to go to the state and look at their archives, and I haven't been to the state archives yet to figure out where this number comes from, this 39th. Because when I worked for the state of Ohio, about the same time, we never prioritized in that way. Everything was alphabetical or just random. But California was much more specific about that. So, this is the way the state of California responds. They say, we are telling the company that we're serious, that we're about closing the site. We don't want to live with these sites in our backyard. The state is prepared to go in and clean up the site if no one wants to come forth and do it themselves. This is clean. This is 1985, and they're saying, we're going to clean this site up. So it was estimated that the site would cost $10.65 million and to clean it up, and it would be done by January of 1987. So wouldn't it be great if things just worked out that way? Once again, the site has no media. There's a few things in the LA Times and in the local newspaper. So now here's the next chronology. I call this the why we need to take regulators seriously is because from 1985 to 1993, we literally moved from we're going to clean this waste site up to the remedy chosen is an asphalt cover with fencing and signage, with things happening in between. And it was kind of shocking, but at the same time not shocking that this happens at this site. Their first response is to put up no trespassing signs. Because what are you doing when you put up no trespassing signs? You're stopping an exposure pathway. If people don't touch it, people can't get sick from it. The EPA gets involved, and the site's placed on the national priorities list. And it's amazing that this site is actually put on the national priorities list based upon what I know about the NPL. But It's one of 802 sites that are on the NPL at that time. And the first response is we need to put up a better fence, and we need to put up signs in both English and Spanish. Finally, things are put in Spanish. 1987. Then from 1988 to 1993, there's no formal contact between US EPA and the people that live there. And then in August of 93, they're presented at a meeting. This is the remedy, with no public, whoops, I don't want to give up the punchline. So, and at this meeting, the guy says, the site almost met the residential risk numbers without doing anything. So he's saying the site's clean. Based upon what we know now, the site is clean. The risk is low enough that there's no reason to fund or plan additional activities. And this site was the 39th most toxic site in the state of California. How do you get there? And that's ultimately what I'm going to be working on. But this is what the EPA's response is. And this gets into the idea of what removal means. We determined complete removal to be very costly for a subsequently small reduction in long-term risk posed by the site, while increasing the short-term risks, because what they felt is if you get workers in there to clean it up, you're increasing the risks of those people that are actually doing the work. So that's what they mean by short-term risks. And since the volume of contaminated material is very large, the risk posed by them very low, and the estimated cost is $120 million, complete removal is not considered a feasible option. And then you can see he's using the word complete. He's modifying, he's modifying the word removal by using it as complete, because he feels that removal has happened, because we've removed the exposure pathways. People cannot come in contact with this waste. So, oops. It continues. Record of decisions finalized, additional investigations at the site, negotiations with responsible parties happens, construction happens. They decide we have to make it pretty. And I wish I had photos, actually, but I didn't bring them with me to Germany. I thought I had downloaded them onto my computer, but sometimes storing stuff on an external hard drive makes you not bring your photos with you. So essentially, construction begins on fencing and asphalt cover, leachate collection, and landscaping, because they realize they have to pretty it up. It can't just look like a parking lot, because the people are 50 feet from this site. And that's the only thing they gave the people that live there, was we're going to make it pretty for you. It actually is kind of, you would never guess it was an NPL site or a hazardous waste site, except for the signage. And so construction's completed, and in 2006, cleanup completed from the EPA website. So it's done. So these people are going to be living with this NPL site for the rest of their lives, their children's lives, till kingdom come at this point. So I use this to show that this change did happen, and it happened in real time and happened to real people. But what I'm hoping to do is find out, and my other research looks at how these documents were created to get from this 20-page document to this larger piece of work that they, the tens of thousands of documents that they have. So I'm hoping, and what I want to do is to do a deeper dive on what does it mean by removal? What do we mean by remedy? Because when we hear the word remedy, we think we're going to heal. We're going to create a remedy. But their idea, that's a remedy, putting down an asphalt cover and a fence, because you're actually stopping that exposure pathway for risk assessment. So I want to take a look at that. But one of the things I really want to do is, instead of looking at the people at Santa Fe Springs and people who are actually working and living at these sites, I want to look at the regulators, the people that are actually making these decisions, that are writing these documents. And that's a big, tall order. And I was going to talk about that today, but I'm still at a stage where I'm not comfortable with what I know and what I think I know about what they're thinking. So essentially what I hope to do is follow that path. And that's why I want to use hodology. I want to follow the path of the regulators to watch how they go, and even I went, from how clean is clean to how clean is clean enough. So, So I want to thank the Rachel Carson Center, Pitzer College, who employs me. And also I want to thank Colby College, because my first talk on this happened when I was there at Colby College. And then I also want to thank my husband, Michael Spezio, who got me really to take a look at the idea of hodology. So any questions? Thanks.